I want to start by saying I'm very proud I got this all onto one board. You cannot read this. No, you can't. Don't argue with me. You can't read this. And I knew at the time I was writing down the trades that I was going to have to read them all out, which I do anyways. And we'll get to that. I think I counted 46 trades that I have up on this board. The Montreal Canadiens, the most successful franchise in National Hockey League history. We can debate about what they've been since 1993 and that, they haven't won a Stanley Cup and they haven't been in the finals. But the reality is the Montreal Canadiens are the most storied franchise. You talk about who the first team is you think of when you think of hockey, and even your casual fans are going to say Toronto Maple Leafs and Montreal Canadiens. Those are the big ones. And that would even be the case in many parts of the States. Montreal, this logo, this look, it transcends the sport. It goes right into all sports. Everybody knows what that means. The New York Yankees and Montreal Canadiens, the most successful franchises, I would argue, in sports history. I know there's other teams people will mention. But for me, it's Montreal and it's the Yankees, and Montreal being easily the best in hockey. The fact that their Stanley Cups sit at 23 and Toronto sit at 13 and Toronto's number 2 on the list tells you just how good these guys are. And they are the last Canadian team to win a Stanley Cup in 1993. So they have that going for them. 101 seasons, and they've been in the playoffs 83 times out of that 101 seasons. They don't miss the playoffs very often. And I know we can look at their recent history and say, well, they do now. But the truth is, they will always have that mystique. They will always have this history. And so there is always that chance of them bouncing back and getting back to their former glory. It can happen, and it's just a matter of time before it likely does. That being said, their all-time leaders, Guy Lafleur's number 1, 518 goals, 728 assists, 1,246 points. Jean Beliveau, 507 goals, 712 assists, 1,219 points. Going through a lot of the historical books that I've got in my collection here over the last few years, Jean Beliveau played at a level above everybody else. So even during Gordie Howe's era, people talk about how it was Belliveau's game, Beliveau's ice, and everybody else was just lucky to play on it. Henri Richard, 358 goals, 688 points for 1,046 points. Maurice Richard, known as the Rocket. Of course, Henri was known as the Pocket Rocket. Maurice Richard, 544 goals, 422 assists, 966 points. Larry Robinson, 197 goals, 686 assists, 883 points. Yvon Cournoyer, 428 goals, 435 assists, 863 points. These are all Hall of Famers. Jacques Lemaire, 366 goals, 469 assists, 835 points. Steve Shutt, 408 goals, 368 assists, 766 points. Bernie Geoffrion, known as Boom Boom by everybody else, 371 goals, 388 assists, 759 points. And Saku Koivu cracks the top 10. 191 goals, 450 assists, 640 points for Saku, who would have been higher if he'd played his entire career in Montreal. Your wins leaders, Carey Price is now the number 1 guy on the wins list with 321. Jacques Plante, 314. Patrick Roy, 289. Ken Dryden, 258. And Bill Durnan with 208. Coaching wins, Toe Blake. And here we're Hall of Fame all over the place as well. The goaltenders, Hall of Famers, coaches, Hall of Famers. Toe Blake, 500. Dick Irvin, 431. Scotty Bowman, 419. Michel Therrien, surprisingly at 4th at 271. Cecil Hartz at 196. Claude Julien could catch him this year if he spends the whole year in Montreal and have a good year. He may be on this board next. The captain's history is long. It is. And it dates back to 1909. 1909 to 1910 and 1911 to 1912. Jacques Laviolette is on the board. Newsy Lalonde, 1910 to 1911, 1912 to 1913, and then 1916 through 22. Jimmy Gardner, 1913 to 1915. Howard McNamara, 1915 to 1916. So the NHL became the NHL in 1917, but it was the NHA before that. And the Montreal Canadiens were in that as well. Sprague Cleghorn, 1922 to 1925. Billy Coutu, 1925 to 26. Silvio Mantha, 1926 to 32 and 33 to 36. George Hainsworth, 1932 to 33. That's right, a goaltender on the Montreal list of captains. Babe Siebert, 1936 to 39. Walt Buswell, 1939 to 40. Toe Blake, 1940 to 48. Bill Durnan, also a goaltender, 1947 to 48. Emile Bouchard, 1948 to 56. Maurice Richard, 1956 to 1960. Doug Harvey, 1960 to 61. Jean Beliveau, 1961 to 1971. Henri Richard, 1971 to 75. Yvon Cournoyer, 1975 through 79. Serge Savard, 1979 to 81. Bob Gainey, 1981 to 89. These are a lot of Hall of Famers in this captain's list. Chris Chelios, 1989 to 90. Guy Carbonneau, 89 through 94. Kirk Muller, 94-95. Mike Keane, 95-96 till he was traded. Pierre Turgeon, captain from 95 to 97. Vinny Domfus, 1996 to 99. Saku Koivu, 99 to 2009. So he had 10 years as captain. Max Pacioretty, 2015 to 2018. I miss Brian Giunta. He was captain from 2009 to 2014. And of course, Shea Weber was named captain in the season we just finished. Now, top 10 picks. This is ridiculous. The Montreal Canadiens, a team that won a lot of Stanley Cups since the draft came into being, have managed to get a lot of really high draft picks. And this, the glyph up here on the board that you can't read, will get into how they got all those picks, and it's worth every single moment I spent writing these down, because you can't overlook how smart Montreal was back in the late 60s, early 70s. There were complaints about how there was the rule that they had the rights to say, hey, there's some French players we want at the top of the draft. We're going to go ahead and grab them first before anybody else gets a crack at them. It was a rule that existed, and I'm just paraphrasing it, but basically they didn't use it much, and when they used it, it was because basically they were told, hey, you got to use it or it's going to be gone. Really, it was really smart drafting by them and tremendous trading. Again, we'll get into that. So their top 10 picks since 1963. Number 1, Gary Monahan in 1963. 1964, drafting 6th. Claude Chagnon. 1965, drafting 5th. Pierre Bouchard. 1966, drafting 5th. They got Phil Muir. 1967, drafting 8th. Elgin McCann. 1968, drafting 1st. Michel Plas. Drafting 2nd. Roger Belisle. Drafting 3rd. Jim Pritchard. And when you get into their trade history, they probably traded for most of those picks. I'm kidding. 1969, they did exercise that rule where they could get the first 2 picks, and they got them. Ray-Jean Houle at number 1 and Marc Tardif at number 2, who would end up, of course, being a star for the Quebec Nordiques. 1970, drafting 5th, Ray Martinuk. Drafting 6th, Chuck Lefley. 1971, drafting 1st, Guy Lafleur. We will get to that. Drafting at number 7, Chuck Arneson. 1972, they draft 4th, Steve Shutt. Draft 6th, Michel Larocque. That's not bad. That's pretty good. 1972, drafting 8th that year, Dave Gardner. So they had 3 in the top 10 in 1972. 1973, they draft 8th. They get Bob Gainey. Pretty good pickup. 1974, drafting 5th. They get Cam Connor. And drafting 7th, they get Doug Risebrough. See, I'm used to 1 first-round top 10 pick per team per year, so I get this whole cadence going. And Montreal throws it off because they have multiple top 10 draft picks most of these years. 1975, drafting 9th, Robin Sadler. 1977, drafting 10th, they get Mark Napier. I missed on the 1974 one as well, drafting 10th, they got Rick Chartraw. So this is just how many they get in 1974. 1978, drafting 8th, they get Dan Geoffrion. I believe the son, or was he the nephew of Boom Boom? Either way, he didn't pan out at the NHL level, but they gave him a shot. 1980, drafting 1st. Again, they get Doug Wickenheiser. Big scandal at the time because Denny Savard was considered a huge star in the making, and they draft Wickenheiser. 1981, drafting 7th, they get Mark Hunter. 1984, drafting 5th, they get Peter Svoboda. Drafting 8th, they get Shane Corson. 1995, drafting 8th, Terry Ryan, who's put out a book of his own on being a top draft pick. 2001, drafting 7th, they get Mike Komisarek. 2003, drafting 10th, they get Andre Kostitsyn. 2005, drafting 5th, they get Carey Price. 2012, drafting 3rd, they get Alex Galchenyuk. 2016, drafting 9th, they get Mikhail Sergachev. And 2018 drafting third, they get Jesperi Kotkaniemi. So, a lot of top draft picks for a team that's pretty darn successful during that period in time and wins, a dozen Stanley Cups in that period in time? Anyways, or period of time. Now, getting to the trades. Now, as far back as I looked is 67. There's a ton of deals these guys made that involved cash. Getting players in for cash, getting players out for cash. A lot of moving guys around at this time. But where Montreal is ahead of the competition is at the draft. So, that being said, we're going to get into the trades now. So maybe get yourself a little bit of a drink, something, because we're going to be here for a while. May 21st, 1968, and I'm going to apologize for the amount of times I lose track of where I am on this board, because again, it looks like hieroglyphs to me, so I know you guys can't read it. Montreal acquires Wally Boyer, Alain Caron, 1968 first, which becomes Pritchard, 1970 first, which becomes Martinook, and Lyle Bradley. In exchange, the California Seals get Norm Ferguson, Stan Fuller, and futures. So they're trading away first-round draft picks, and Montreal says, yeah, we'll bring them in, we'll draft these guys, and they keep getting high draft picks. June 10th, 1968, so at the same time, they acquire a first-round pick in 1972, so this is 4 years out from that draft, which becomes Dave Gardner, a cash as well, and Marshall Johnston. Minnesota gets Danny Grant, Claude LaRose, and Bob Murdoch. So again, they're getting first-round draft picks. We'll take one 4 years from now, one 3 years from now. Be crazy if a team was doing that now. Also on June 10th of 1968, Montreal acquires a 1972 first-round draft pick. That's the second for those following along at home. They get Bunny Larocque as that draft pick. Also, Tom Thurlby joins the Montreal Canadiens, and going to California, Brian Watson and cash. So the California Seals trade a draft pick that becomes Michel Larocque, who was a pretty darn good goaltender for about half a decade. June 11th, 1968, so a day later, 1968, Montreal acquires a 1969 first-round draft pick, becomes Raymond, that they draft early, a 1972 first-round pick, which becomes Steve Shutt, no big deal, and going LA's way is Jerry Desjardins. So they're trading away roster players and getting back picks because they've got tons of depth in the organization. And these picks are just going to add to that. June 12th, 1968, Montreal acquires a draft pick they won't keep, the 1973 first-round pick that becomes Tom Lysiak, a 1973 second that becomes Blake Dunlop, and going to the California Seals, can you believe this? They wanted Carol Vadnais on waivers, so they're like, hey, if you give us a shot at him on the waiver wire, we will hand you these draft picks. Montreal went, all right. So, yeah. January 23rd, 1970, Montreal. Dennis Hextall. They also get a 1971 second-round pick, which becomes Larry Robinson. No big deal there. And going the other way to LA is Dick Duff. Yeah. May 22nd, 1970, Montreal acquires cash, as well as the number one draft pick in 1971, which becomes Guy Lafleur, and Francois Lacombe as well. The California Seals get a first-round draft pick, which becomes Chris Odlofsson and Ernie Hickey. California Seals keep throwing those first-round draft picks and second-round draft picks to the Montreal Canadiens. Don't worry about it. I'm sure these guys are just going to be Hall of Famers. No big deal. Montreal is playing in a whole other realm. They're Stanley Cup champions. They're a dynasty. They're the best team in the league. And their general manager is going to other general managers on lesser teams and saying, we'll give you these players who we've got in our organization. And because they're in Montreal, they're winners. And we'll just take a draft pick. You don't need to send us anything else back. At this point, the draft's importance isn't really a big deal to these guys. So they're like, sure. I think it's the Guy Lafleur draft that really changed things. But GMs don't learn. They really don't. So let's continue. January 13th, 1971, Montreal acquires Frank Mahovlich. In return, Detroit gets Guy Chiron, Bill Collins, and Mickey Redmond. Mahovlich is a pretty big figure in hockey, and both Pete and Frank were together in Montreal during the 70s. November 4th, 1971, Montreal acquires Dennis DeJordy, Dale Hoganson, Noel Price, Doug Robinson, and a 1975 first-round pick that becomes Pierre Mondeau. The LA Kings get Rogie Vachon and a first-round pick that becomes Tim Young. So you can argue LA wins that deal. You can also argue, how does Montreal have this many goalies that they can keep shedding them? Don't worry, they're not done yet. June 6, 1972, Montreal acquires a 1973 second and cash. The New York Islanders acquire Alex Campbell, Dennis DeJordy, Glenn Resch, you may know him as Chico, and Germain Gagnon. So Rogie Vachon and Chico Resch are traded by Montreal a year apart, not even. And yet Montreal, with Ken Dryden, they're pretty good. Michel Larocque, drafted, pretty good, yeah. Montreal has always had really good goaltending. And that's probably an understatement. May 15th, 1973, Montreal acquires a 1973 first, which becomes Bob Gainey. A fourth-round pick, a 1975 first, which becomes Sadler, who's on the board here. In return, St. Louis gets a first-round pick in 1973 that they used to draft John Davidson, and a 1973 third-round pick that becomes Bob Gassoff. Davidson's a pretty good goalie, but I'd rather have Gainey's career than Davidson's. Just throwing that out there. May 29th as well, 1973. So the same day, they acquire another first-round draft pick in 1974 that they will use to draft Rick Chartraw. And in return, the Atlanta Flames get Chuck Arneson. So, yeah. Again, it's that same thing, right? Then March 9th of 1974, because Montreal loves first-round draft picks, they acquire another one in the 1974 draft that will become Doug Risebrough, and St. Louis gets Dave Gardner, who had been a first-round draft pick previously for the Montreal Canadiens. So they're turning first-round draft picks that don't necessarily reach their potential and trading them to get more first-round draft picks. It's fantastic. June 26, 1975, Montreal acquires Doug Jarvis. Toronto acquires Greg Hubik. I'm going to give Montreal that trade. I don't need to look up Greg Hubik to know Montreal wins that trade. June 12th, 1976, Montreal acquires a 1977 third, a 1978 first that they use on Dan Geoffrion. LA gets Glenn Goldup and a 1978 third, so the Kings are again trading away a first-round draft pick, which I talked about with the Kings. Turns out all the first-round draft picks were just getting eaten up by Montreal. That's what was happening at that stage. September 13th, 1976, Montreal has the option to swap draft picks with Colorado 4 years later. They go to Colorado and say, okay, we'll swap you draft picks in 4 years if we choose to do so. Also involved in this deal, Colorado gets Ron Andriff, Sean Shanahan, and then the swap happens. Montreal drafts first. They draft Doug Wickenheiser. If it had been Denny Savard, this is on the list of worst trades ever. Colorado drafts Paul Gagne with the number 19 pick that year, which would have been Montreal's. Just crazy. We'll swap you picks in 4 years. How did they know Colorado was still going to be bad? I guess they were paying attention. August 18th, 1977, Montreal acquires a 1979 third. So again, they're thinking a couple of years down the road. That 1979 third becomes Guy Carbonneau. And in return, St. Louis gets Jim Roberts. November 29th, 1977, Montreal acquires Pierre LaRouche, Peter Marsh, and the Kings acquire Peter Lee and Pete Mahovlich. I'm going to go ahead and give that one to Montreal as well, with Pierre LaRouche joining the team. October 18th, 1978, Montreal acquires a 1981 first, which is Mark Hunter, and Pittsburgh gets Rod Schutt. I liked Rod Schutt. He had some fun hockey cards. I don't know that I'd give up a first for him, though. February 17th, 1981, so we skip a few years. Montreal acquires a 1983 second-round pick that becomes Claude Lemieux, and the LA Kings get Rick Chartraw. That's, of course, the pick that Atlanta gave up back in 1973, so they turn that pick into Claude Lemieux. Just, it's wizardry going on here. December 21st, 1981, Montreal acquires a 1984 first-round pick. 3 years in advance, they're going, we want a first-round pick that year. Just, it's so smart. Which is Peter Svoboda, a 1984 second, which becomes Brian Benning, and a 1985 third. Hartford acquires Pierre LaRouche, a 1984 first, which will be used to draft Sylvain Cote, and a 1985 third-round pick. So even though at the time this is a bad trade for Montreal, Svoboda going back the other way makes it eventually a really good trade. That number 5 draft pick that Hartford gave up to get LaRouche, big mistake in the end. I don't think they realized how bad they were going to be. I guess Montreal, again, saw the future. September 9th, 1982, Montreal acquires Ryan Walter and Rick Green in what Capitals fans know as the trade. Washington gets back Brian Engblom, Doug Jarvis, Rod Langway, and Craig Laughlin. This is a huge win for Washington, but Ryan Walter and Rick Green played key roles on the 1986 Stanley Cup champion Montreal Canadiens. So while we like to give this trade to Washington, the Capitals don't win a Stanley Cup after Montreal does. Kind of evens out that trade. October 28th, 1983, Montreal acquires Bobby Smith. Minnesota gets a king's ransom for him. In Keith Acton, Mark Napier, and a 1984 third that will become Ken Hodge Jr. Napier and Acton were both, I guess, unhappy with Montreal at the time. Napier had been unhappy for a while, and so they trade him out, and they get back Bobby Smith. Now, while Bobby Smith never reaches his huge point totals he did early in his career, he is still a solid player, and again, plays a role in that 1986 Cup win. June 9th, 1984, Montreal acquires a 1984 first, which becomes Shane Corson, and a second, which becomes Stéphane Richer. And going the other way, St. Louis gets Rick Walmsley, a 1984 second, which is Brian Benning, another second-round pick, Tony Herkus, and a third-round pick, which becomes Robert Dirk. So you can argue Herkus was a pretty good player. I would say Corson and Richer, kind of important guys for Montreal. August 19th, 1986, Montreal acquires Brian Hayward. Winnipeg gets Jan Ingman and Steve Penny. So Steve Penny's replaced by Patrick Roy. Montreal wins the Stanley Cup with Patrick Roy. He makes it clear, I'm the greatest in the world. And Montreal goes, we got you, and Penny's out the door. And Hayward would go on to play really well as a backup. That was the best battery in hockey for years. June 12th, 1987, Montreal acquires a 1987 second-round pick, which they used for Jean Leclerc, as well as a 1988 fifth, which becomes Peter Popovic. St. Louis gets a 1987 second, which they use for Robert Nordmark, and a 1988 second, who doesn't end up playing a substantial amount of time in the NHL. I'm going to go ahead and even though Nordmark was a Canuck legend, I'm going to go ahead and say Montreal wins that deal. June 13th, 1987, Montreal acquires, so it's a day later, a third-round pick in that same draft, and they use it for Matthew Schneider. New Jersey gets David Maley. Going to go ahead and say, even though Maley was a decent enough guy, Schneider's the better player in that one. That's a great deal for the Montreal Canadiens. November 7th, 1988, Montreal acquires Russ Courtnall. Toronto acquires John Kordick and a 1989 sixth-round pick. It's as bewildering now as it was then. Russ Courtnall's the better player. March 6, 1990, Montreal acquires a 1991 second-round pick that they use for Craig Darby. Vancouver gets Jyrki Lumme. This is an example of Montreal trading for a draft pick. They didn't need Lumme. Lumme was kind of an extra for them. He was a depth guy. But for Vancouver, he will be a really key player. And Montreal fans years down the road will admit, yeah, no, we should have kept Lumme. He was pretty good. Probably overplayed in Vancouver. This is nothing unusual for Vancouver defensemen. But Lumme had a really solid career. I do wish he'd shot the puck a little more, but solid career. June 29th, 1990, Montreal acquires Denny Savard. Chicago gets Chris Chelios in the 1991 second-round pick. Yeah, they gave up a draft pick for Savard as well. The desperation for scoring was there, and that's how this trade ends up happening. September 4th, 1990, Montreal acquires Sylvain Turgeon. New Jersey gets Claude Lemieux. This is where the magic starts to come off. Sylvain Turgeon, I get it. You know, he's a French player that they're figuring they can get something out of him. It just never quite clicks for Turgeon. He's and trading out Lemieux. Lemieux wears out his welcome wherever he goes, but Claude Lemieux also wins wherever he goes. August 27th, 1992, Montreal acquires Vinny Domfus and a 1993 fourth. Edmonton acquires Shane Corson, Brent Gilchrist, and Vladimir Wojtek. Wojtek was one of those guys, too, that was kind of an in-betweener. But you thought, if this guy can get it going, if this kid just gets a chance, and then it just didn't quite work out for him. But still, Montreal wins that deal. August 31st, 1992, the Montreal Canadiens acquire Brian Bellows. Minnesota gets Russ Courtnall, and Bellows was a solid player for Montreal. Pretty sure he was on that 93 Cup winner. February 9th, 1995, Montreal acquires Mark Recchi, a 1995 third. Philadelphia gets Eric Desjardins, Gilbert Dion, and John LeClair. This is where the magic really comes off. So Recchi, who's able to score 120 points, and Montreal, it's mixed results, and LeClair goes to Philly and becomes that big 40-50 goal scorer. And just, he's in beast mode most of his time there. And, of course, Eric Desjardins is a really important player to Philly. So Montreal loses that trade. December 6, 1995, Montreal gets Andrei Kovalenko, Martin Rusinski, and Jocelyn Thibault. Colorado gets Mike Keane and somebody named Patrick Roy. That's not a good one for Montreal either. So if we were having a tally board right now, we're starting to see some losses for Montreal. March 2nd of 2004, so jumping ahead 9 years. Montreal gets Alexei Kovalev. The New York Rangers get Joseph Belay and a 2004 second, which, yeah, I'll go ahead and give that one to Montreal. Belay was one of those guys, too, that there was always a belief he was going to get better, and it just never really happened. March 8th, 2006, Montreal gets David Abbotsford. Colorado gets Jose Theodore. So Theodore, a few years removed from being all-world in net, and Montreal goes, nope, luster's gone. Abbotsford was the replacement for Patrick Roy in Colorado, and it didn't really work out for him. So the Abs thinking, hey, we picked one goalie out of Montreal and it worked pretty well, let's do it with another. February 25th, 2007, Montreal gets Josh Georges and a first-round pick in the 2007 draft, which becomes Max Pacioretty. San Jose gets Craig Rivet and a 2008 fifth. I'm going to say that's a bit of a win for Montreal. Looking at it now, I'm not sure what San Jose was thinking with Rivet. He's a good player. He wasn't great, but a good player. Not worth losing the first rounder for. June 30th, 2009, Montreal gets Tom Pyatt, Scott Gomez, Michael Busto, and the New York Rangers get Pavel Valentenko, Ryan McDonough, Doug Janik, and Chris Higgins. So the big names in this, of course, Scott Gomez, that terrible contract for the Rangers getting traded out, and they get back Ryan McDonough, a good kid that Montreal really misses on the blue line when he goes to New York. June 17th, 2010, Montreal gets Lars Eller and Ian Schultz. St. Louis gets Yaroslav Halak. And while Eller, pretty solid number 3 center, Yaro Halak, seeing him leave town is odd because he had been basically responsible for this team doing really well in the playoffs. And that's where they really took a risk because it's Carey Price's net now, and there were a lot of people that were nervous when that took place. February 26th, 2016. So we jump another 6 years for this one. The Montreal Canadiens acquire Philip Dano, 2018 second. Chicago gets Dale Weiss and Thomas Fleischmann. Huge win for Montreal, that one. Huge win. And Dano, I still think, is better as a second/third line center. But you know what? He's played really, really well for Montreal. And on Chicago's side, neither Weiss nor Fleischmann are still there. So I'll give that win to Montreal. June 29th, 2016. Right towards the start of this channel starting to blow up. PK Subban was traded by Montreal to Nashville for Shea Weber. And of course, at the time, a lot of people couldn't figure it out. I could see it from both sides, and I tried to argue I could understand from both sides how this trade worked. Subban kind of wore out his welcome in Montreal with management, and Weber was, to them, the best replacement. Weber's been pretty solid for Montreal when healthy. June 15th, 2017, Montreal acquires Jonathan Drouin and a 2018 sixth-round pick. Tampa Bay gets Mikhail Sergachev. An odd trade only because I thought Montreal needed depth on the blue line, especially scoring depth on the blue line, and Sergachev would have filled that need really, really nicely for the Montreal Canadiens. So that didn't end up being a deal that I thought helped them a lot. I know there's Montreal fans that love Drouin, and great, perfect, fine, but I still think Sergachev scoring 40 points a year on the blue line would have been nice too for Montreal. June 15th, 2018, so we're up to about a year ago. Max Domi, of course, acquired for Montreal from Arizona. Arizona gets back Alex Galchenyuk. I can understand the trade from both sides, and while at the time it looked like Arizona had done really well picking up a goal scorer, in the end Montreal gets the better player, and Galchenyuk's already been moved on from by the Pittsburgh Penguins, or to the Pittsburgh Penguins from Arizona. September 10th, 2018, Montreal acquires Thomas Tatar, Nick Suzuki, and a 2019 second-round pick in exchange for Max Pacioretty going to Vegas. And I think this trade so far looks like it could very well be a win for Montreal. A lot of this is going to depend on how Suzuki plays for them as a rookie this year. If he's a really, really solid rookie who puts in all the work, and if he's willing to play whatever role Claude Julien gives him, this kid could be a keeper, and it could end up looking bad for Vegas in the meantime. Although Vegas is quite happy with Pacioretty at this point. We'll see how things turn out. So there you go. The Montreal Canadiens. It's hard to get all this on the board. I know there's trades that got missed. Because the amount of space that I was running through, especially up until about this point, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to have to start being really, really picky about which trades I put up here. So I put up the ones that I thought were key, and I made sure as many as possible were up on this board that involved stealing draft picks. And I hate to use the term stealing, but Montreal was definitely stealing. This was armed robbery, and it was against people who clearly weren't armed with much of anything, and there was no foresight. If Montreal can do the build again, so it's there. The potential is there for this team to get back to being one of the better teams in the league. If they can do that while keeping an eye to the future and being able to acquire the right young kids and keep drafting well, you've got Paling coming in this year and Suzuki potentially coming in this year on top of Kotkaniemi, who was fantastic in his debut last year. There's reason to believe that while we may never reach these heights again, where it's dynasty after dynasty after dynasty, which is what Montreal was back in this right up until the 70s. At the very least, this team could end up being one of those ones that wins another Stanley Cup. They win that 24th Stanley Cup, and I don't know that I would bet against them being the first Canadian team to win the Stanley Cup since 1993. Only because you look at this history, you look at how smart they've been along the way. I know it hasn't been as good lately, but there's always that chance. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. As always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing right through. You just happened upon this video. And that is it for the history of the Montreal Canadiens, meaning that next up on the list is Nashville, who I'm pretty sure I wouldn't find 46 key trades from over their much, much shorter history. But thank you guys so much for all your support. And by all means, I will talk to you again soon.